So if you haven't heard already, Next.js and React has finally released the stable version of server components and the new app directory. And that includes caching, data fetching, database right inside of your components, and server-side rendering the new way. So in this video, we're going to see everything that you need to know about server components and client components, and what are the best practices to create the most optimal performance Next.js and React applications. The latest version of Next.js 13.4 has finally come with a stable release. And the stable release in here, actually a prouder version that was released a couple of months ago, now is finally stable, ready for production to use, and that actually includes React server components. So why and a lot of other people that loves React are super excited about React server components, including a bunch of different stuff like suspension streaming, data fetching in here, nested routes and layouts, and so much more that the new version actually brought to the table that we can't resist as developers. So server components are the new React feature that actually allows your website to go super performant and gets rendered completely on the server itself. So for instance, if you take, for example, this particular website layout in here where you have a sidebar, a navigation bar at the top, and some other components like a search bar where the user can type something like say search. It can go a button where the user can click on something. But for example, here, if you take, for instance, what is the difference between these components? In the ones that are in magenta are server components. Why? Because they are a static component that doesn't need to be re-rendered. They only just show you data. Even links could be static. Everything that doesn't actually need user interaction something, or doesn't need to have state at some point, is a server component. But for client components, it is whatever something that needs some sort of interaction, maybe some specific browser APIs, or you need to handle and manage state. For example, for a search input, you need to have a state, you need to be able to fetch from the API, so much more. So that makes it a client component. But other than that, everything, 90% of the stuff on the website usually could be a server component. So some of the benefits of using server components are you have a fast application because everything renders on the server. All API calls and whatever API call you need to do, REST API, GraphQL, or even database calls in here are happening right on the server, right from the components, right from your rendering logic. One of the favorite things for me is keeping environment variables secret right on the server, so you don't need to transfer them to clients and expose them for user vulnerable stuff. Everything stays secret on the server. And last but not least is the bundle size is so much less because you don't need to transfer JavaScript. You don't need to do rendering on the client side in here. You don't need to do rendering on the browser, and that's gonna result in a better performance, and you have happy customers eventually. So to better understand how server component actually works and how we can use them to build rich applications in React with interactivity, API calls, databases, and so much more, I tried to build in here a small Twitter clone where you have tweets in here. You can fetch them from a database, and once you see them, you can just go and click on one tweet. It just opens that up for you, and you can just add a comment say, oh wow, this is looking pretty good, and you can submit. You get the comment in here, just something simple in here. And remember, everything in here I built in here using server components and just teeny tiny parts of client components, but most of them 95% of the time I'm just using server components with server actions. So in Next.js 13.4, by default, everything now, any component you create using the new app directory, not the old pages directory, is by default a server component. So let's for instance take, for example, this sidebar in here. Because it has nothing, we're not doing anything, it doesn't have any interaction, we don't need to have state for it. So it's just a sidebar, we're just rendering some static HTML for it and some CSS. So this technically is a server component. And let's see how this is actually being rendered. So if you go to the application in here, we have got the timeline, and this is actually where we're rendering stuff. Here, this is actually the new app directory. So we have it a layout. Everything in here is a server component. The layout in here starts with HTML body, and we have the Twitter navigation bar in here, children. All of those are going to be nested together. Now, the Twitter nav bar in here, if we try to go ahead and open that up, is in a component, and yes, it is a server component. So this component here, the Twitter navigation bar, is a server component and is actually being rendered on the server side. Only the rendered HTML and CSS is going to be transferred later on. And that makes it super fast. And one of the awesome things in here, for example, I'm using React icons in here because there's a huge amount of icons from different variety of libraries of icons. This could potentially have large bundle size. So if you potentially import this in a client-side component, or if you usually do it how we usually do with React without server components and stuff, this would have needed to be imported inside of an actual React application. So you have to be putting it inside of like the bundle, and you have to serve it back, and the browser has to wait to fetch that out, and yada yada yada, a bunch of different stuff in here that's going to make it slower and slower. But here, server components, because everything is rendered on the server, this component, this like importing here, this React icons is always only going to be imported inside of the server, but the browser and the client doesn't know about that. It just doesn't need or care about that, which makes it super fast. So as in here, if we look into the network tab in here and go to like the timeline where, you know, doing HTTP timeline, what is this one actually being sent on the server. And if you look at the preview, as in here, the static navigation bar is already being loaded, like has all the buttons and everything, you know, just static HTML. Later on, it's going to apply the actual CSS that is actually imported from here. Now, let's see how we actually created this timeline here, where we are fetching some tweets from an actual database and we are actually rendering it on a server component. So how are we actually doing that? So if I go to the timeline in here, go to the page.tsx in here, which is the main page that is going to be rendered on the timeline. So this is basically a server component here. What I'm doing first is actually doing, Prisma tweet find my. And if you just take a closer look, Prisma in here is an ORM, right? And I'm literally calling the database right on inside of the component. So I'm just doing Prisma tweet find many. So this colon here is just going straight into the Sequelize database I have right here inside of the Prisma dev.db, just right from the component, because it's actually a server component that gets rendered only once. It doesn't need to re-render because it has no state. So I'm doing that. I'm fetching the tweets in here. I'm doing await. So I'm using async inside of the component, and I wait for tweets in here. I map through the tweets and I render each tweet. And that's exactly what I mean when I say you can do API calls or database API calls directly inside of the component in here and have everything being taken care of by the server itself. So if I try to do a console log of tweets in here and I go to my console, I'm going to the terminal in here when I'm running the server, actually, not the browser console, because remember, this is running on the server. So we got tweets and actually being fetching everything. All the tweets in here from the database are fetched. So it works perfectly. Also, to better understand how everything works, I'm adding like a custom wait in here where it just like waits 5 seconds. So for us to actually see if this is actually being rendered on the server or just like a, so I'm adding wait in here for 5 seconds. And what I'm actually going to do is actually like get to the timeline in here. The new Next.js in here allows you to add a loading.tsx that gets rendered before the actual page in here has been like rendered. So you go do like loading tweets in here. This is actually the fallback component that's going to be rendered on the suspense. So if I go back right here, go ahead and fetch, as quickly as I do loading tweets. So it gets loading tweets in here, and the page in here is actually still loading. So you see the actual page that is being like loaded from the server. So like, if you just refresh that, as you can see, the page never ends refreshing because the server is still processing the request, like preparing the response. And once it's done, and it just like returns the response with everything that you need and all the tweets in here fetched and rendered on the server. There is another demo in here from the Next.js team in here, which is like, a clone of our Hacker News, where it uses the Hacker News API to actually fetch all of those, but it does actually use or fetch the API inside of a server component, renders a server component inside of the server on the server side, and it just returns to you the HTML. So the same thing we're doing it with the database, and they're doing it with an actual RESTful API. So if we look into the code, there's actually the React server components page where I'm doing fetch data. So the fetch data in here actually goes, which is another function that is asynchronous, that being cached. So here it's actually like a React function, a new React function that allows you to cache stuff. So it uses cache in here, it allows you to fetch data, and it uses fetch. Fetch in here is like, modified version fetch of Next.js by default. And you've got like the way in here to revalidate or actually save stuff and then actually having caching working. And with cache, you're going to make things a lot faster, and the requests in here are more like controllable and cached. And to see if the actual fetch API is being sent from the client or being just sent from the server, we can just go ahead and refresh and look on the network tab in here. So you see the localhost is pending. That means it's actually fetching stuff. And if we look like a little bit closer in here, there's nothing that you can say that's being sent from the server, because if you go to fetch x-r, there's no fetch or x-r request actually being sent in here. That means everything, like literally, is being fetched and rendered on the server. So to see when to actually use a server component versus when to use a client component and what is the difference between them. So for example, here we have this like application in here where you can just like go either on the timeline, or when you click on something, it just takes you to the actual tweets page where you can add a comment, or you can click on the heart in here and actually, oh, you get an API in here where you get an alert. And remember, an alert is actually a browser API, so it has to be using like a client component, or it has to be triggered from the JavaScript that runs on the actual browser itself. So if I go back in here and actually go to the tweet ID, which is the page where we're in, that's actually where it happens, actually doing some fetching in here. So we're just doing, parse ends, we go to, Prisma like database in here, we fetch that, yada, yada, yada. We already went through that. And eventually we're rendering the tweet. So the tweet component here is actually the main part. This tweet component actually has the image we render, the profile image of the user. It renders the author name and the text in here, created as, and so much more. But if you look on the top in here, remember, because that one in here needed some interaction. So when we click on it, we're using alert. But if you go back in here, that tweet component is an actual server component, right? Because it doesn't have a use client in here on top. So what's happening? So if we scroll down a little bit, what happens in here is actually a good pattern or a good practice is always split your client component to a small part, as small as possible. So here, I split the tweet actions in here into a separate component. That tweet action is an actual use client, which means this is actually a client component. And this, if you scroll down, actually, when you click on the heart in here, it has an on-click event listener and does provoke or, trigger the alert of love this tweet. So what's the reason of actually splitting that one? Because now we only have this really small component with a couple of just stuff in here that, the stuff that needs only the interaction, only the components that needs interaction. So only this component, this small parse, this small JSX and HTML is only going to be rendered on the client. But if you compare it, if you want to like go here and add, I want to add or want to make this whole tweet and use client. Imagine a huge amount of stuff in here that's going to become a client thing. Well, you don't need that. You only need a small part. So always make sure to split your stuff. Make sure your like client stuff or the stuff that needs an actual client interaction, always like separate them in a small component to have the best optimal performance. And if you're wondering, how can I use server component or how can I submit data inside of server component? Because we're already seeing that you can go ahead into a database, fetch some data from the database or from an API, render on a server component and return it back. But imagine you have a server component, but what you want is actually have a form in here and you want to submit the data into an actual database. Do you really want to go ahead and create a separate API call as we usually do in Next.js? Or is there something else? Likely for us, there's a new awesome feature, but unfortunately it's still in the alpha phase, but this feature is super mind-blowing. So it's called server actions, where it allows you to use server components in here and immediately use standard form or standard HTML form actions to submit the data into an actual server action. So to see this, if you go to we have two components, the comment list in here to show the previous comments, and you have add comment, which is a component that allows you to add a comment. So if you go inside of it, immediately you would realize, oh, this should be a client component because you have an interaction, you have a form, you need to type stuff, and you have to click on a button. It has or used to be a client component here, but with server actions, it doesn't need to do that anymore. And yes, you don't need to track state. I commented that code in here. And what I did, it added another one. This is actually called a server action. What it is actually a function or an asynchronous function that has on the top called use server. So that will tell Next.js or React that, oh, we're using a server action in here, and this function in here should be running on the server. So this function here, what it's doing, actually using an API or like the Prisma API. So it's going straight through to the database and actually creating the new comment by providing the data. It's saving the comment to the database in here. Like if you go save comment to DB, which is the one on top in here. So it's creating that one, doing asynchronous stuff and revalidating the path, which means like it re-renders the current page to show the new added data. And for the form in here, that's actually the most interesting part. If button in here, submit, there's no on clicks, there's no on submit. There were an on change in here in value to capture the state, but not anymore because we're on a server component here. The only new thing is the action in here. So we do action and we do add comment. So we provide our function action here, which uses the use server directive and to make this work as an actual action. So for example, in here, let's try to go ahead and add a new comment. So just type something in here. I'm going to open the network tab to see exactly what's going to happen. So I'm going to click submit. As curious in here, it's sent an HTTP call, but we're not doing it ourselves. Like Next.js is going to take care of that, like using the standard HTML form action API. API. So behind the scenes in here, it's actually sending a post request. It has a payload, which is the form data payload in here, and actually has a preview, and everything now should be saved. Let's close in here. It's an amazing feature. We have saved it, and we're just like showing it in here. Like, I can just go in and clear that out. So it's an amazing feature. I love it so much. And if I go to a database in here, that's it. If you see the comment here, this is the comment, has been added. It works perfectly. So thank you guys for watching. That was actually Next.js, and stay tuned for more Next.js content.